And I will proceed to the introduction. So thanks everyone. This is our fourth session today, and we are going to be talking about now is the time to address the intersection of ageism and ableism. This is, as I said, the fourth session of our Activity Strong virtual summit. And my name is Charles Vilmorin, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of Link Senior. Before we get into the presentation, which I'm really excited about, I wanted to share a couple housekeeping reminders, and then I'll introduce the speakers. And this session is special in many ways, including the fact that we're not going to have slides, but more of a panel discussion between Ashton, Penny, and Peter. So, as with our previous sessions today, I'd like you to keep in mind the fact that you can earn up to 6 NAB, NCAP, and/or NCCDP CEUs today. To earn the credits, you need to attend the full session, as few as one session if you want 1 credit, or up to 6 sessions. And you need to fill out the required post-summit CEU survey, which will be emailed out to you at the end of the day today after 6 p.m. Eastern on June 23rd. You need to fill out that survey before midnight on Friday, June 26th. And because of the volume of requests for CEUs, you will get the CEUs by the end of the day on Wednesday, July 1st by email. I also wanted to share that this presentation, as with all the other presentations today, is being recorded, so you'll be able to access it yourself through our website, and we'll share the details by email afterwards, and you're more than welcome to share that with your team as well. Talking about recording and technology, I want to share something important, as we've been getting a lot of questions, which is that we're using 2 platforms today. We're using Zoom, and then we're using Facebook Live. You're more than welcome to participate and be active on both, but just so you know, in order to get the CEUs, you need to be at least on the Zoom platform. And then the final piece about Zoom is, as you can see, we've had a record number of participants, and because of that, you're more than welcome to use both the chat and the Q&A feature. But to direct questions or comments to the speakers and the panelists today, we will only be moderating the Q&A feature. The chat is more than welcome to use it, but the Q&A is the easiest way for us to filter, answer the questions, and then address them to the speakers. The last thing I'd like to say is, for the ones that are participating in our bingo game, the bingo word for the session is people. Now, I want to also pause about this game because we've had many, many requests about it. If you're looking for the bingo card, the game, it is available on Facebook. If you go to Activity Strong, our Facebook page, and it's also available on the website dedicated to the Activity Strong initiative, which is simply activities with an S, strong.com. So 2S, activitiesstrong.com. With that, I'm very excited to introduce you to the speakers today. The first person I want to introduce you to is Ashton Applewhite. She's been on some webinars before. I'm a huge fan of her work, and she presents herself as an author, activist, and ageism expert. Hi, Ashton. How are you?
Hi.
Next up, we have Penny Cook. Penny Cook is the president and CEO of the Pioneer Network, which is one of the core foundations when it comes to person-centered care in the senior living and long-term care industry. And last but not least, I also wanted to introduce you to Peter Sladen, who's the founder and president of the Sladen Group, LLC. As a reminder, as I've said before, we are not going to have any slides, so I will stop sharing my screen. I will also remove my video to let the panelists talk about this important topic. Penny, Ashton, Peter, it's all yours.
Thank you all for attending this session. I hope you're still fresh. I'm Ashton Applewhite. I am the author of This Chair Rocks, a manifesto against ageism, and an activist working to make discrimination on the basis of age as unacceptable as any other prejudice. Imagine that, although the Black Lives Matter movement is clearly a reminder of how far we have to go on many fronts. The name of this session, as Charles mentioned, is Now is the Time to Address the Intersection of Ageism and Ableism. It doesn't take much head scratching to realize that a tremendous amount of ageism is rooted in fear of becoming disabled. Disability and aging are different. They also overlap in important ways. Both olders and people with disabilities encounter discrimination and prejudice, and both groups face stigma, a lot of it. Many olders refuse to use walkers or wheelchairs. I'm sure you've encountered that, even when it means never leaving home, because the stigma is so great. My uncle wouldn't use a white cane even when he grew completely blind, preferring to depend on the kindness of strangers and taxi drivers. I have a not yet 40-year-old friend who broke her bone in her foot, and she opted for crutches instead of a cane because they signal injured, not old or disabled. And cognitive impairment is even more stigmatized. Unfortunately, being older or having a disability doesn't keep us from being ageist or ableist. Age cooties, disabilities make me uncomfortable. We've all thought these things, at least I have. And that is how prejudice works. It frames the other group, what we think of as the other group at least, as alien and lesser than ourselves. This makes no sense, not that prejudice ever makes sense, because people with disabilities come in all ages, after all. And we all, those of us lucky to live long enough, will encounter changes in our physical and mental capacities. Healthy aging can and does involve disability. As people in your industry know better than anyone, people age well not by avoiding illness and disability, but by adapting to it. So I've been talking for years about the need to stop ignoring this overlap, but talk is cheap and easy. And then along came COVID, which really exposed how deeply ageism and ableism are intertwined. Think about the early messaging around the virus. Don't worry, it's only going to infect only, in air quotes, the old and the ill. Here's a thought experiment. What would the unemployment rate, the economy, the death toll look like if we had known from the beginning that the virus was also going to affect the young and healthy? Very different. That is the lethal impact globally of ageism and ableism. And the exciting thing is that we now have a historic opportunity to build on that awareness. So I'm going to go on talking about the ageism piece. Peter will address the ableism piece, and Penny will be tying the two together from an industry perspective, and hopefully we'll have time for a few questions after that. So how did I start doing what I do? I started learning about longevity because I was afraid of getting old. And in a matter of weeks, I realized that everything I thought I knew about what it would be like to be really old was way off base or flat out wrong. It's not that our worries and concerns aren't real. I am not a positive aging Pollyanna, but our fears are so out of proportion to the reality. And we only hear one side of the story. Take the fact that only 2.5% of Americans over 65 live in nursing homes, and that the number is dropping. Take the fact that older people enjoy better mental health than young or middle-aged people. The U-curve of happiness, that the data that shows that people are happiest at the beginnings and the ends of their lives, is a function of the way aging itself affects the healthy brain. Take dementia. Alzheimer's is a terrible disease, but it is not typical of aging. 90% of us will think just fine to the end. It may take a little longer to remember where we put our damn glasses, but we're going to remember it, right? And dementia rates are falling. Nobody knows. That's what I mean by only hearing one side of the story. The likelihood of any person at this summit getting diagnosed with dementia has gotten lower and lower, and people are being diagnosed at later ages. The real epidemic is anxiety over memory loss, and that anxiety itself makes us more vulnerable to the very thing we fear. People with a fact rather than fear-based attitude towards aging are less likely to develop dementia even if they have the gene that predisposes them to the disease. And that's why the World Health Organization, not the World Old People Organization, right, is developing a global anti-ageism campaign to extend not just lifespan, but health span. So I started feeling a whole lot better about getting older, and I started obsessing about why so few people know these things. And the reason is ageism, behaving or feeling differently about someone or a group of people on the basis of how old we think they are. Ageism is the reason only 3% of social work students concentrate in gerontology. It's the reason only 10% of American med schools require geriatrics coursework or rotations, and less than 1% of graduates choose geriatrics, despite the fact that surveys show that geriatricians love their jobs. It's the reason you hear why or are condescending how good of you when you tell people the kind of work you do. Everyone's ageist. No one's born that way, but our attitudes towards age, just like towards race and gender, start to form in early childhood, and we are barraged by negative messages about age and aging from childhood on, starting with children's books and Disney movies. And we olders can be the most ageist of all because we have had a lifetime to absorb these messages, and most of us haven't stopped to question them. And unless we do, they become part of our identity. That is internalized ageism. And unfortunately, people in aging services are far from exempt. Your expertise lies in caring for the frail and needy elderly, that's the phrase that comes around a lot, which is incredibly skilled, important, valuable work. But this model reinforces a deficit view of aging as loss alone. And reconciling that view of old age with what we hope lies ahead for ourselves is really hard to do. Aging is not the problem, right? We're all aging. It means moving through life. The problem is discrimination. As the Black Lives Matter movement is teaching white people, it is not having dark skin that makes life harder for Black people. It is racism. It is not the wheelchair that makes life harder for wheelchair users. It's ableism, the stairs between them and where they want to go, and the fact that there's no damn ramp. And it is not the passage of time that makes getting older so much harder than it should be. It is ageism. When labels are hard to read or we can't open the damn jar, we think I should be stronger or better prepared or more limber. We blame ourselves instead of blaming the ageism that makes these natural transitions shameful and the ageism that makes these barriers acceptable, the discrimination, right? And this discrimination harms us all individually and collectively in countless ways that we are just beginning to wake up to. And it makes your work infinitely harder because a society that doesn't value its older members doesn't value the people who work with us. So I decided to take a look at some of the reasons people use to justify ageist policies and attitudes. The big one, society is going to be swamped by all these old people. The deficit model casts population aging as an insurmountable catastrophe. You might have heard the phrase gray tsunami. It was coined in 2010, and it summons a frankly horrifying version of a giant wave of old people looming on the horizon, poised to drain the public coffers and suck all our resources out to sea and swamp the healthcare system. And what we are facing is no tsunami. It is a demographic wave that scientists have been tracking for decades since we baby boomers were born. It's washing over a floodplain, not crashing on a defenseless shore. And this alarmist rhetoric justifies prejudice against older people, and it legitimizes our abandonment, and it feeds young versus old ways of thinking, right? Us versus other. It's never young against old. Families are multi-generational, so are communities. Both the 1% and the 99% are made up of all ages. The corollary to that fear number one is that society will be swamped by all these sick old people. Now, all these older people does indeed, this longevity boom calls for massive investment into the biology of aging and related medical issues. That is a real issue and a challenge. The caregiver crisis is real, as you know well, and growing more acute. but new and often expensive medical treatments, the ones that make it, many of us, possible for us to age into old age, and that make it possible to treat more conditions than 50 years ago. That costly medical technology, not population aging, is the main cause of these rising healthcare costs. That's why US healthcare is so expensive. The deficit model of aging equates aging and illness. In cultures that have meaningful social and economic roles for older people, physical health is just one aspect of aging. But in ours, sickness takes center stage. Aging is not a disease, otherwise living would be a disease, but our society conflates the two, just as it does with disability, although people with disabilities will assure you that they are not sick. If older people seem preoccupied with their ailments, it's worth keeping in mind that little else of what makes life meaningful is available to many of them, and that's what makes the agenda of this virtual summit so important. Infirmities get way more attention than strength and capabilities. Doctors and family members also often don't think of older people as capable of full recovery. And patients collude because we've had a lifetime to internalize expectations of declining health and learned helplessness and media depictions of older people who buy medicine and maybe a cruise on occasion and not much else. Blaming decline on aging instead of on illness perpetuates the negative stereotype of all older people as frail and debilitated. Most are not. Over half of the oldest old, ages 85 and up, go about their everyday activities without personal assistance. Mobility, like dependence, like everything else, is relative. Let's point fingers at the media. Aging is typically framed as triumph or tragedy. 50-somethings debilitated by early onset Alzheimer's, or 80-somethings jumping out of airplanes. Almost all of us, by definition, are going to land in the way less newsworthy middle, like my friend Wendy's 86-year-old aunt, who lives in a high-rise in Queens. And when Wendy came for a visit and suggested a walk, her aunt reached for one of those stand-up shopping carts that pass for a car in New York City. And Wendy said, "Are we going shopping?" And her aunt shook her head very vigorously. And she placed her purse in the cart. And as they headed down the street, Wendy realized she was using the cart as a walker. It didn't look like a walker. And on the way back, when a leg cramp struck, her aunt hobbled over to lean against the bus stop until the pain eased. And she whispered, "This way people will think we're waiting for the bus." This is a wonderful story about adaptability and a wretched one about the dual stigmas of ageism, that is, and ableism that again make growing harder in this society, so much harder than it should be. Age-friendly products and environments aren't just wheelchair and walker friendly, they're skateboard and stroller and delivery guy friendly, they're all age friendly. When do we stop valuing people and why? Because we grow old, but because we do so in a world that silences and sidelines its older members. Dismantling ageism, it's a big job. It's going to take nothing less than a mass movement like the 20th century movement that catalyzed a mass shift of consciousness for women around the world. Think where we would be without the women's movement. And what happened during the women's movement was consciousness raising. Women shared stories and realized that the problems they were experiencing as personal problems, like getting harassed or not getting hired, were actually social and political problems that we could come together and do something about. And that shift in awareness is the linchpin of movement building. Change is underway around the world. For evidence, in case you think I'm delusional or making this up, check out the campaign section of Old School. That's oldschool.info, which is a clearinghouse of free, vetted anti-ageism resources. We have a lot to learn from the fantastic activists who in the 1970s and 80s reframed the way we see disability. They changed it from a personal misfortune into a social problem, bingo, and then demanded integration and access and equal rights. Olders and people with disabilities, who of course are often the same person, share the same goal, as do you, a culture that rejects narrow definitions of productivity and attractiveness, finds meaning within limitations, and takes a realistic and inclusive view of what it means to be human. We have to accept the ways our bodies change over time. We do not have to accept being discriminated against because of it. Aging is inevitable. Ageism and ableism are not. Let's join forces against both. Thank you. Take it away, Peter.
Oh my God. Thank you, Ashton. And you got it all. I don't have to say anything.
There you go.
Not true. I really appreciate that. You did touch on a lot of the commonalities, and there are more, trust me. First, I'd just like to say hello to everyone. You probably don't know me. I'm Peter Slayton. I am, as Charles said, I am the president of Slayton Group and the co-president of Slayton Media Group. And we help organizations provide excellent service to people with disabilities. And our live and in-person workshops basically remove the mystery about what people with disabilities want and need. And really our goal is to help those organizations provide the great service that their customers need and avoid bad outcomes like ADA-related litigation and just plain old bad PR. And I'm sure you see plenty of that kind of thing in your industry as well. So I'm going to go into the dark side a little bit, you know, and Penny alluded to this, but when COVID-19 hit and the coronavirus emerged, we had sentiments like the Lieutenant Governor of Texas telling us that all we have to do is, and I'll paraphrase, but you know his intent was basically, let's let the old people die so young Republicans can take their place. I mean, young people can take their place. And people with disabilities were right in there with them. And those of you who know your history, and I'm sure that's all of you, know about eugenics and the practice of the Nazis basically killing people with disabilities and older people. And you know, while that does seem like a world away, I've actually seen Twitter feeds of people with disabilities really terrified that that might happen. This is, after all, the world where social media can take us on quite a tangent. So let's talk about ableism and what it is. And although we think about it as starting with behavior and being behavior related, and of course it is, it manifests in other ways too. My friend, the disability rights attorney, Lainey Feingold, and I'm not sure how old she is, but she's older than I am, but she asked me the other day, she said, so when I can't do something digital or do something in the built environment, something I feel I should be able to do, is that because of poor design or cognitive decline? And she, of course, answered her own question, being smart. She said 99% of the time, it's because of poor design. And what that says to me, and I wholeheartedly agree, is that design really is, and where inaccessible design happens, this is the ultimate physical expression of the confluence of ageism and ableism. And universal design is basically what we think of as design for people with disabilities, but really it's design for all. And yet there are other words for it, like human-centered design. Now, I have a problem with that particular word because unless you're designing a half of a zoo that's used for animals, it's really all human-centered design. And even that half is designed so we can look at the animals. Unless you think a garden is vegetable-centered, I would assume it's so that we can garden in it. So let's look at a basic example of ableism. I have to look no further, and I'm very sad about this and angry about it. I have to look no further than a famous vision rehabilitation agency here in New York, one of the oldest and largest in the country. It has about 150 employees, including a brand new CEO. And you can name the number of blind employees on a hand that's missing a couple fingers. That's right, 3 blind people on staff of 150 people plus, hoping to serve the blind and visually impaired. What does that tell you? It tells you that the people who run that agency basically don't believe that blind people are capable of teaching other blind people, and don't even believe that blind people are know enough about what it's like to be blind to teach other people how to be more successful and more capable as blind people. And, you know, I guess that's just wrong. That's all you can say about that. Now let's look at a more formal example, and that would be the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. If the Americans with Disabilities Act is defined as a condition that inhibits the performance of a major life ability, then ableism can be defined as a person who has that belief, and ableism believes that someone with a disability basically is less than they are. And that's just kind of a strange construction, but we all know that less than is not equal to. And just if we recall back to the founding of the country and where we are now, slaves were considered, and African Americans and Africans were considered 3/5 of a person. And we're still dealing with that legacy today. That's where we are. So when I talk about disabilities, disabilities are, of course, they run the gamut. They have physical and neurological disabilities, visible and invisible disabilities, which are usually related to, but not always the same as physical and neurological. And of course, mild to severe disabilities. And what do they have in common with ageism? You know, it's the gamut, and ageism runs a spectrum from people like me who are 65, and so by some definitions I'm senior, by other definitions I'm 5 years past that date, by other definitions I'm 10 years past retirement age, by other definitions I'm a long way from being old. So it's a question of perspective. But with disability and age, you know, one of the things our similarities abound, in part because of the way society relates to people with disabilities and older people. They share so many similarities, very striking similarities. And as I just hinted at, there's the confluence of how we see each other, how we see ourselves, how society sees us. And I think one very important aspect of looking at it and understanding it is that disability and age, we each share a very unique perspective on our own situation, our own condition. And that situation can change, that perspective can change, it can shift, but we experience our own disability uniquely. The way I am blind and the condition that makes me blind may be the same as someone else who has the same condition, but I will experience blindness and low vision in a very different way than they will. And again, in a very different way from someone who has blindness due to another condition, and someone still who has yet another condition. Every one of us experiences it uniquely. And you know from your practice that every one of your older people, your clients, whatever they're called today in the social service setting, every one of them experiences their age differently, experiences the challenges of their age and the positives of their age differently. And we take those lessons and we take those perspectives and we share a common bond among each other with them at the same time that we share those unique patterns of blindness and age and disability, whether you are a wheelchair user who's a paraplegic or a quadriplegic, whether you use a manual or a power wheelchair, whether you can give someone a firm handshake or not. These are all the same elements of something very different. You experience that differently. So you also will, either way, you're going to be pissed off if someone calls you wheelchair bound, because wheelchair bound makes you a captive of your wheelchair. You're not a captive, you use your wheelchair as a tool. It's an important tool without which you could not accomplish the many things you can accomplish, and you could not enter society the way you can, and the way you were not able to for many, many years before the Americans with Disabilities Act made that possible. Now, Ashton referred to the Americans with Disabilities Act and the movement and used the magic word bingo. And of course, you all know that, yes, it was abracadabra and things were legal, but we are still a long way, a very long way from where all things come together to the place where accessibility is something that's considered at the outset of design and development of any product, any place, any website, whatever you want. Accessibility has to drive design. It is not an obstacle on the way to design. It is not an afterthought on the way to completion. Without it, you have nothing today. And that's, one of the big words we use today is inclusion. And I understand that it's a good word, but I think we can do better. I think we can do better because what's wrong with inclusion? Well, if I'm going to be included, I have to wait for someone to invite me. I really don't want to wait because guess what? I'm here already. I just don't have to wait. But if it's up to the people who've been excluding me for centuries to decide when it's okay to invite me, then we have a serious problem. I prefer the word, I want to create my own accessibility. Back to the ADA. The ADA did engender physical accessibility. We first thought of it as, let's create those accessible doors, open ramps and doorways with push buttons and all those other things that make it possible for people to move safely through an environment. Then, as the internet became a greater feature of society, we have started to create digital accessibility, and that is still a huge problem. And thousands of lawsuits are filed each year about digital accessibility. I am proud to say I recently got involved with my first demand letter to an organization just the other day. And that I'm sure applies to the older people you work with. Even if you're trying to help them learn to use the web, if the websites they use aren't accessible, meaning they can't be used by a screen reader, or they can't be used by someone who only relies on gesture, or who uses a tube to breathe commands through, or movements of their head, then they're not accessible. Then they don't have access to what is making the world so transparent today. And they're not part of that global conversation. So that's another place where ableism and ageism are absolutely in sync. So there is, so you have environmental, physical, and digital accessibility. What is missing still, and what I'm about, and I believe what Ashton is about, and what Penny is about, and I believe really what you all are about, is the third leg of that stool. It's really a foundation. And that is social accessibility, the role of social access, without proper interaction, we just are left out in the cold. Now, I have worked a lot in the hotel environment, doing my training in a hotel environment, and I say to the people I'm working with, well, you can have wonderful spaces, great rooms that are perfectly accessible, and you can have a perfectly wonderful digital environment, website, but if you're treated like crap by the people who greet you and don't know what to do with you, and they manhandle you, then you will remember the bad service. And that goes right back to that bad PR and ADA-related litigation I mentioned up top. So let's go to one of the great confluences of ageism and ableism. It's basically the shared barrier that people with disabilities and older people have. For people with disabilities, it's the barrier of accessibility. For older people, I think it's the barrier of acceptance by society. And we can both swap those two barriers out. I can have the barrier of acceptance. Older people can have the barrier of accessibility. It's all the same. But where does that barrier come from? Where does it really come from? How come all that's there in the first place? Why do we even have to deal with this? It's because, as Ashton mentioned, as Kirsten mentioned, and I'll probably hear again, it's about fear. It comes from fear. That's its name. Now it has another name, if you ask me. That name is, what I call it, is the contagion response. Now, I've been calling it the contagion response for years, and now it has a lot more relevance than it had a year ago. Because what is the contagion response? It's when people simply are afraid to catch what we have. They don't want to catch blindness. They don't want to catch paralysis. They don't want to catch deafness or being hard of hearing. And the truth is, historically, those were things you can catch. Just as you can catch the coronavirus and develop COVID-19 and not be able to breathe, you could catch polio. You could catch measles, and these things create disability. So there is something rooted in reality in that reaction, that fear reaction, and yet we're not there anymore. We've moved past that. But still, people have to grapple with this fear. And what happens when they see us, and I'll say us meaning someone who has a disability, someone who is older, and they're reminded that there is a condition that they just don't want to deal with, don't want to have. Well, first they're afraid. They feel that fear. Then they feel a sense of relief. Good fortune. I don't have that. That's not me. But then, because we're all good humans, they feel a sense of survivor's guilt. And they know that they've lucked out for no good reason other than the luck of the draw. And that could be them. Now, how do you deal with that? You just, if it's you who has that feeling, and we all do, and Ashton actually mentioned it, just because I have a disability doesn't make me immune to having the contagion response, to being afraid of someone who I see who is clearly unable to speak or think properly. Actually, I say clearly. What do I know about clearly? It may look to me like they can't, but I don't know what. But what I really want to say is that what we do to deal with that fear is we try to create distance between ourselves and what is generating that fear. And we create distance by diminishing that person, by getting dominance over that person. And the way we do that, especially how we diminish someone, is we change their circumstances in relation to us. We assign them lower expectations or low expectations. We create pity for them. We infantilize them. We give them names. We call them ugly. We may say they are alien to us. We take away their purpose. Old people, what use are they? People with disabilities, what good do they do? We make them burdens. Instead, we have to take care of them. They can't do that by themselves. They are burdens. So we make them other, and we take away what we can from them. So then we can feel superior. And someone else used that word too. We have a sense of superiority. We have control. We have dominance. And then, once we have that, we can make decisions for them. Unfortunately, as you know, when we make decisions for someone else from that perspective, we are going to make bad decisions because we are starting from a false premise. It's as simple as that. Now, how do we deal with this issue? This issue of diminished personhood. As a matter of fact, as a nation, we are dealing with it in its most virulent form right now. that's what's happening. For us, what we can do is we have to face it in ourselves. We have to address it in our own person, our own personhood, in our own language. And we have to accept that we have to deal with it, that it is ours. We have to own it. And we learned this at home. We learned this behavior at home in our families. We learned it outside in the world among other people. So where can we go to unlearn it? We have to look to ourselves, but we also can look to our colleagues and friends and peers and relatives to see examples of what can be done and to think about what we can do. And that's really where we can find help and assistance in ourselves. So, we learn low expectations. Low expectations begin and take root along with the shame of disability or the shame of being older, of old age, a word that Ashton used very well. Shame and low expectations, they take root in the home. And we carry them with us as we go out into the world. And low expectations, believe it or not, may be the high point for some people, in contrast to the infantilism and pity that can be heaped on them by people who love them but don't know how to find that love and put it in its proper setting. And they may even carry that love or those negative feelings with them as they bring their package of a person and their feelings, whether it's to a senior care home or a vision or a disability rehabilitation facility. And what we miss there, what do we miss there? We miss the fact, again, that people who with disabilities and older people have something that society, not just generally, but universally tends to overlook or ignore or just simply not want to understand. People with disabilities and older people have perspectives and experience that are extremely valuable and that is unavailable to anyone else. That experience, those perspectives, those valuable sensations and awareness that they have becomes even more valuable when disability and age overlap. Helping professional caregivers understand the role that magnifying negative and positive self-characterization plays in managing outcomes can really, in the care and service that they deliver, really can change and influence an outcome profoundly. And of course, by reinforcing and magnifying the negative messages of ageism and ableism, we virtually assure a negative outcome in that service setting or in any setting. So we need to learn to accept that we own those messages, that we carry them with us, and then we can begin to put them aside. We can begin to bring a sense of understanding and empower people with disabilities and older people we can help enable them to take and make the positive choices that they've been looking for a road to most of their lives, if not all of them. Thank you.
Thanks
you very
so
much,
Peter.
Yeah. Penny, just a quick reminder that we have about 12 minutes left. Thank you. This was very, very moving.
Sorry I went so long.
Oh, that's fine.
Every second of it was very valuable. Thank you.
This is such great information, Ashton and Peter. And, I feel like what Peter said after you spoke, Ashton, that I don't have to say anything. But I have a few things that I want to say.
Please.
Because this is my passion as well. And I really believe that everything that Peter and Ashton said has such applicability in senior living. And really that's what I want to talk about. I think this intersection of ageism and ableism happens long before we even realize it. You know, as Peter was saying, when people are asked why they fear growing older, there's a fairly common response. And it's usually based on that fear of loss. That fear of loss on ability. We seldom hear people say, oh, I'm afraid of the gray hair, or I'm afraid of the wrinkles. Yes, I agree, we try to cover those up sometimes. But a lot of times what people say is that they're fearing that loss of ability, whether it's cognitive or physical, the loss of the ability to remember, to think clearly, to walk, to care for oneself. And really that list goes on. And because of this response from so many, I would venture to say that ageism wouldn't be so prevalent if we didn't have the ever-present partner ableism. And it's one of the reasons why I don't think that we should separate the two, because I don't really think that we can. As you've heard, they're different. But that intersection between the two of them really plays out as we grow older, and especially in the world of senior living communities. These two isms, as I will call them, are really a double whammy for the people who live there. And we probably have all seen the examples. You know, on a systems level, we have a method of delivering long-term care that offers limited choices once a person's abilities or disabilities reach a certain level. And I think financial resources have a huge impact on this as well. So if you think about it, if you have someone who needs a high level of care and support, and they don't have a lot of financial resources, their choices in where they receive that care and support are quite limited. Let's look at this prevailing view that children should be provided care and support in their family homes. And I don't think that any of us would disagree with that. But older people sometimes have no choice at all but to receive that kind of support in a congregate living setting. And why is that? Well, I don't think that we expect that when we grow older that we'll not want to stay in our family home. Studies have shown, people say all the time, I'd like to do that. So what is this reflective of? Well, I think it's really reflective of ageism. We obviously have a very different view of children than older people, and that's okay. But I think we need to really examine how that viewpoint is being played out. I think there are a lot of other practices in senior living communities also that promulgate ageism and ableism as well. The first is this paternalistic attitude towards residents. And you heard Kirsten talk about this when she was talking about COVID-19 and the virus, this struggle between safety and quality of life. Or I would say safety and rights. I think that especially in senior living, we have this attitude sometimes that we know best, that we know how to keep people safe. And you might have heard the term in senior living, surplus safety. That's this concept that was coined by Drs. Bill Thomas and Judah Ranch. And it's really an excess of caution that's not necessarily proportional or desirable by the person that it's being applied to. So it almost seems that no matter whether you're 60, 70, 80, 90, or you have 100 years of life experience, the thought is that you may not be able to make the best decisions for yourself, even with all that experience. And if we think about this, think about children. You know, we teach children about risk and danger with the hope that as they grow older, they'll be able to self-monitor. So why do we start going back to the mentality of thinking that we know best once somebody comes to a certain age? Now, I understand there may be the argument that as people experience cognitive decline, they may need support in their decision-making and some help assessing risk. And I'm not going to argue with that, because I think there's a way that it can be done that's appropriate for that person without blanket policies for everyone. If we look at outdoor spaces, some communities have policies that no one can go outside without someone accompanying them. Now, pre-COVID-19 policies, I'll say. But some individuals might need that one-on-one support, but not everyone does. And people don't always lose that innate ability they have, like opening a door and having it be cold outside and deciding that they don't want to go out. Whether you have cognitive decline or not, you can keep that ability. So it's their choice and their decision. People don't lose that right as they grow older. Another example of the isms is really categorizing people into one group instead of treating them as individuals. Peter, you actually mentioned about being 65, and where does that leave you? You know, we use terms like 55 and older, right? Or 60 and older, or under 75. Well, think of this range of people that we're talking about when we talk about this classic word that's sometimes still used, senior citizens. We're talking about an age range of possibly 60 or 65, maybe even 55, or I think AARP, when does the membership start, at 50? To possibly 105. What other group of people do we categorize that way? I mean, if we look at a period, take adolescence, it's 10 years or less. And there's a variety of difference between a 10-year-old and a 19-year-old. Well, there's a variety of differences between a 55-year-old and a 105-year-old. And one 55-year-old is not the same as another. One 95-year-old is not the same as another. And I think we need to remember that when we're talking about any kind of programming of services or care and support. I'm going to shrink down a little bit what I was going to say, but I have to make one point, and it's because, and we talked about this, Charles and Megan, when we all got together on the call and we were talking about bingo. And I think, Charles, you said something about whether you agree with bingo or not, whether you like it, that's what we're going to use. But think about that. You know, I was an ombudsman for a number of years, and probably every care community that I visited, there was bingo on the activities calendar. And it was a weekly event, sometimes a few times a week, at every single nursing home I went into, including the state veterans home, where mostly men lived there. And I'll tell you, there was no interest in bingo because no one ever showed up at bingo. But I think that it was the classic example that, you know, there was the idea that older people like bingo, so we should have it on the activities calendar. And thank goodness, I know that we've moved away from that. And thank you to all of us involved, because I think it was, you know, all of our collective decision-making that helped us to realize that we need to look at people as individuals. And really, that's what I want to end with, is really, what can we do? You heard from Ashton, you've heard from Peter, that now is really the time to look at our beliefs and actions. It's really more important now more than ever with everything happening in our country. And I do believe it is because of what we've seen and we've heard about the impact of COVID-19, especially what we've heard. And I think the racial justice protests do affect all of us who work in senior living, both the people who live in our communities and the people who work in our communities. And I think there's a sense of urgency like we've never seen before. So I encourage us to do a few things. I want to say this session is not meant to be critical at all about how we've thought in the past or what we've said in the past or what we've believed, because I think that we all evolve. We all evolve as we grow older. And I love the Maya Angelou quote, as we know better, we do better. And so I think that just as we have more information, we begin to shift our focus. And there are different ways that we can do that. A few things I would suggest: I think we need to move away from the questions about what we do and really move into who we are. How do we be? What are our passions? Those are things that I think that we can all have answers to, that don't depend on our age, our abilities, the color of our skin, where we live. That question about doing becomes really hard for people sometimes. And I think in order to get to know people, we really want to know what they are about. What is their essence? What are their passions? I have a friend, Heidi Wagner, who runs the Passions Project, and that's what she asks people. What's your passion? Instead of that classic question that we ask people that we've first met, what do you do? I think also the principles of Pioneer Network can really help us as we look at these isms. Pioneer Network is based on a set of 13 principles that guide our work. And there are 3 that I think directly apply to our conversation today. The first are that relationships are the fundamental building blocks of a transformed culture. Whether it be the culture of a senior living community, a neighborhood, a city, or even a country, relationships help us create a culture that decreases the rise of the isms. The second principle is to know each person, and it goes along with the first. We all have a need and a desire to be known, to be acknowledged, and to be validated for who we are, not for our age, not for whether we use a wheelchair or a walker or a cane or hearing aids or need oxygen, and not for our diagnosis, who we are as a person. And the last principle is the belief that each person can and does make a difference. Imagine just now thinking about that before we meet someone, going into an interaction, knowing that the person you're talking to makes an impact in this world just by being them. Again, no matter age, ability, skin color, ethnicity, sexual orientation, or anything else. It kind of sounds like a new world. And that's what we want to create. That's what we all want to be a part of. So with that, I know that our time is up, and I know that we had some questions both in the Q&A and the chat, and I am sure that our information is going to be somewhere that you can email any of the 3 of us and ask those questions.
We're easy to find.
We're easy to find.
Very.
Yeah. Thank you so much, the 3 of you. It's been amazing. And, you know, just looking at the chat box, it's apparently we're steering a lot of very good discussion. I want to thank the 3 of you one by one, which is Ashton. I want to thank you for your thought leadership. I think I met you more than 2 years ago. And in this anti-ageism world, you're definitely one of the stars. In the star way, but also the guiding star. And I want to share with the audience that Ashton and I had discussions, and she is the one that recommended and pushed me that we also consider ableism as part of this presentation. So Ashton, I want to thank you for this, because when you do this to people like me, you help us become better humans in a way, and it's important, like you shift our perspective. The same way my personal perspective have changed tremendously with the Black Lives Matter movement. We get to be better humans when we push the envelope. Peter, I want to thank you for taking the time to being with us here. And I want to thank you for one thing in particular, which is very important for me personally, is allowing us to make it a we conversation, right? When you allow us to make it a we conversation, we all, like Penny said, know better and have an opportunity to do better. And lastly, but obviously not least, Penny, I want to thank you for helping us bring that to our market, right? Everyone on the call is mostly from the senior living and long-term care market. But I want to kind of reiterate what you said, which is that we want to make sure that ableism is part of the ageism discussion. You know, the last thing also that I want to kind of bounce off of what you were saying, Penny, which is when you shared one of the foundations of the Pioneer Network. Throughout the presentation today, we've been talking about innovation, from technology, from programming. You know, your session right now help us understand how we can innovate with our attitudes and our words. And when you share the fact that for the Pioneer Network, it is person first, you know, obviously this is the nature of activities and life enrichment, and I'm sure that resonates a lot with everyone on the line. So with that, thank you, the 3 of you. We'll be sharing the presentation and the contacts of every speaker. And again, thank you very much for helping us innovate in these times of crisis, and hopefully make all people cool, as everyone else. Thank you very much. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, Charles.
Thank you.